Hello, my dear students, and now I am back with a new chapter, Air, which is chapter 4 of your book. So let's start with this chapter. So, what topics will I be covering with you? Number one, what is atmosphere? What constitutes atmosphere? The layers of the atmosphere. Weather, climate, the difference between the two. What is temperature and what factors affect the temperature? What is air pressure? How is air pressure measured? And what are the factors which affect the air pressure? Winds and its types, and rainfall, terms associated with rainfall, different types of rainfall. So this is what I will be covering in this chapter. So number one, atmosphere. What is atmosphere? It is a huge blanket of air. So let's learn more about it. Now, the word atmosphere is taken from the Greek word atmos, which means vapor, and sephira, which means sphere. So it means a huge blanket of air, which is responsible for the survival of all living beings. So, what is the importance of atmosphere? One, it provides us with the air we breathe. It protects us from the harmful rays of the sun. And number three, it moderates the temperature. अगर एटमॉस्फेयर ना हो तो days would be burning hot and nights would be freezingly cold. So the atmosphere is nothing but a huge blanket of air. Now, what constitutes atmosphere? So what all do you find in atmosphere? You find a mixture of gases. So that means lot of gases, but not in a same proportion, but in different varying proportion. Now, 78% of the oxygen is composed of nitrogen, 21% oxygen, and the 1% that is composed of carbon dioxide, helium, hydrogen, ozone, and argon. Some impurities like dust, smoke, salt, carbon monoxide, and other chemicals are also present. Now, when I say nitrogen, it is the largest component of the atmosphere. And nitrogen is important for survival and growth of the plants. And the next most important is oxygen. Oxygen is second most plentiful gas in the atmosphere, right? And it is the most important gas for the survival of the human beings. Now, moving on to the balance between the carbon dioxide and the oxygen. Now, we know that the plants make their food through the process of photosynthesis, which involves the use of carbon dioxide. So plants take carbon dioxide and give out oxygen, which is required by the living beings. So it is the plant which maintains the balance between the carbon dioxide and oxygen. And if this plant cover is reduced, so what will happen? The balance between the plants, the balance between the oxygen and the carbon dioxide will not be balanced, right? So this balance will be affected. So in short, if I tell you that if this is so, then what is the greenhouse effect or what is the global warming? See, these two terms that you normally come across are linked to the higher levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Now, this carbon dioxide level in the atmosphere affects the Earth's weather and climate. And the only way to reduce carbon dioxide is to maintain the balance between the oxygen and the carbon dioxide, and that is maintained by the plants. So it is the plants which maintain this crucial balance between the carbon dioxide and oxygen. Now, moving on to the layers of the earth. Now, many of you just get confused with the layers of the earth. Now, layers of the earth and layers of the atmosphere are two different things. The layers of the earth, as I talked to in my previous video, is core, mantle and crust. But when we talk about the layers of the atmosphere, now we know what is atmosphere. It is a huge blanket of air, right? So at the bottom you have the troposphere, then you have the stratosphere, then you have the mesosphere, thermosphere, and the last is exosphere. So let's do these layers in utmost detail. I hope this chart will help you to learn this and later to revise when you're doing this chapter. So let's start with the very first, that is the troposphere. It is here, yes. Now, number one, it is the lowest layer of the earth. Now, ये layer जो है सबसे earth के नज़दीक है, so it is also the densest. So when we talk about the troposphere, it is the lowest and the densest layer. It extends about 8 kilometers at the poles and 18 kilometers at the equator. Now, all the weather phenomena takes place here. Now, the next important concept is the lapse rate. Now, what is the lapse rate? Now, lapse rate is as you go up, the temperature decreases. Right? So as you go up with the increase in height, there is a decrease in temperature. For every 165 meters, there is a decrease in temperature of 1 degree centigrade. Always remember, decrease in temperature means ठंड बढ़ती है. Temperature को आप heat के अगर आप easy term में use करो, so when I say decrease in temperature, that means heat कम होगी है, that means colder. So that means अगर आप 165 meters ऊपर जाओगे तो 1 degree centigrade temperature जो है उसमें drop आएगी. The uppermost edge of this layer is called as tropopause, and beyond this the temperature decreases and protects us from the excessive heating throughout the day and maintaining a certain temperature at night. The next layer now, that is stratosphere. Now, stratosphere extends at a height of 50 kilometers above troposphere. Now, when we talk about the ozone layer, this layer is contained in the stratosphere. And what is this layer? Ozone layer is the layer which absorbs the ultraviolet radiation of the sun. Now, very important thing. Now, stratosphere is very important for flying jets. Why? Why do you think this would happen? Because stratosphere is a cloud-free zone. That means no weather phenomena takes place. So, stratosphere is ideal for jet flying. The next thing is your mesosphere. It is here. Now, this layer extends up to the height of 80 kilometers. Here the temperature decreases. Temperature decrease means ठंड बढ़ जाती है with height and reaches to minus 100 degrees centigrade. Now, mesosphere, always remember with M. So, meteoroids burn up in this layer when they enter from the space. So, whenever they enter from the space, it is here that they burn up. That is in mesosphere. Then is the thermosphere. Now this layer extends up to the height of 400 kilometers. Here again the temperature rises rapidly with the increasing height. But thermosphere has some special particles known as the ions. Now what are these ions? They are the particles that reflect the radio waves back to Earth and enable us the wireless communication. And because thermosphere has these ions, so sometimes this layer is also referred to as the ionosphere. Right? Then the last one is exosphere. Now this is the uppermost layer. It extends up to about 1600 kilometers and then it merges with the interplanetary space. The air is very thin. It contains gases like helium, hydrogen that float into space from here. So this is all about the layers of the atmosphere. Now let's move on to the next slide. Okay, now let's talk about weather and climate. Now, what is the difference between them? Now, very, very briefly, if I talk about the two, then weather means the atmospheric conditions in a small area over a short period of time. For example, during the day, the weather might be windy at one time, sunny at one time, right? Whereas now when we talk about the climate, now climate refers to average weather conditions of a large area over a long period of time. And climate of a place is of permanent nature. For example, India experiences tropical type of climate and Sri Lanka enjoys equatorial type of climate. Right now, the elements, this is very, very important. The elements which influence the weather climate are. Now, what do you think can influence the weather? It can change the weather, or it kind of influences the climate is number one, temperature, number two, pressure, number three, winds, humidity, precipitation, sunshine, and the cloudiness. So all these factors affect the weather and the climate. So very, very briefly, weather is a temporary condition, whereas climate is more of a permanent atmospheric condition. All right, now let's move to this particular diagram. Well, I would just explain this diagram to you. Now you have to understand the sun is the major source of energy for the planet. We know that atmosphere moderates the solar influence by moderating the temperature. Now, the greenhouse gases like water vapor, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, they absorb energy and trap it in the atmosphere. And activities like urbanization, energy consumption, agriculture, all this influences the environment. Now, extreme weather events like heat waves, droughts, tornadoes, they are all part of Earth's natural climate. And one thing which is actually affecting our climate is the carbon dioxide, increasing levels of the carbon dioxide, right? All right, so now moving on to the next slide, which is temperature. Now, first I will tell you what do you mean by temperature and temperature किस पे depend करता है, right? So let's move on. Now, what do you mean by temperature? Now, temperature means a degree of hotness or coldness in the air. When I say lower temperature, I mean it is cold. When I say it's like high temperature, that means hotness, गर्मी है, high temperature. Low temperature जब आपको coldness है, थोड़ी हवा में ठंडी ठंडी जो है. Now you can say, all right. So temperature हमने समझ लिया, it is the degree of hotness and coldness. Now what does the temperature depend upon? I mean, how do I say the temperature is on the lower side or on the higher side? See, number one thing you have to understand, this temperature depends upon the solar energy, and the amount of solar energy that our earth receives is called as insolation. So बार बार ये word आपके book में आता है and you always get confused. What is this word insolation? Insolation means कितनी solar energy जो है, the amount of solar energy जो हमारी planet जो है receive करती है. Now that means आपका temperature कितना है will depend upon two factors. Number one, the amount of the solar energy. Number two, height above the sea level and distance from the sea. Now I will explain both the points. So let's be clear, temperature means degree of hotness or coldness, and it depends upon two factors. Number one, the amount of the solar energy. Number two, height above the sea level and distance from the sea. Now amount of solar energy. Now again बच्चे कितनी solar energy earth receive करेगी, that will again depend upon the latitude. Now अगर जो है, of course this solar energy will be more near the equator, so it will be higher in the places near the equator, and if we go towards the poles. Now, if I say this is the equator and this is your North Pole, so I will say that the areas here that is near the equator will have higher insulation, higher amount of solar energy, and it will decrease as we move towards the North Pole or towards the pole, right? Towards the South Pole or North Pole as we move towards the pole. Again, bache, the amount of solar energy will also depend from season to season. So one thing which impacts temperature is the amount of the solar energy. So solar energy depends upon the latitude. That means the places near the equator will have more solar energy, will have more higher temperature, whereas as we move towards the pole, the temperature will decrease. Right. Now, the second point I talked about is the height above the sea level and the distance from the sea. Now, this you have already done in your 6th grade as well, that places near the sea will experience a moderate climate, and of course, jo sea se dur hai, away from the sea, will experience extreme climate. Right? Now, the most important topic, that is the air pressure, and a little, kind of a difficult chapter to understand, especially when it comes to temperature, air pressure, what causes temperature, what affects air pressure. So, we will kind of deal, I will deal individually with all these topics, and together also I will try to revise with you. Now, what is air pressure? So, air pressure is the pressure which is exerted by the weight of the air on the Earth's surface. Now, your question would be that if air exerts pressure on the earth, why do not we feel this pressure? Why? Because air presses from all the direction, and our body also counters that. So if air is pressing this side, our body also counters this pressure, and it is measured by an instrument called as barometer, and barometer is measured in the units of millibar. So this is very important. You have to understand that air pressure, that air exerts pressure, right? And this pressure exerted by the weight of the air on the earth's surface is the atmospheric pressure. And now the other question I talked to you, that why doesn't our body feel that? Because if the air exerts pressure on the earth's surface, then even our body counters this pressure, and this air pressure is measured by the instrument called as barometer, and in the unit in which it is measured is called as the millibar. So let's move on to the next slide. Right, now comes the factors which influence the air pressure. Now, before I start with that, let me just go back to temperature. जब हमने टेम्परेचर किया तो हमने क्या कहा था कि टेम्परेचर को दो चीज़ें अफेक्ट करती हैं. पहली, कितनी अमाउंट ऑफ सोलर एनर्जी हम रिसीव कर रहे हैं. दैट अगेन डिपेंड्स अपॉन द लैटिट्यूड. जो एरियाज अर्थ इक्वेटर के बिल्कुल पास है, दे विल हैव हायर टेम्परेचर. जैसे आप पोल्स के तरफ जाओगे, द टेम्परेचर विल डिक्रीज. राइट. दूसरा मैंने कहा था कि प्लेसेस नियर द सी विल एक्सपीरियंस अ मॉडरेटिंग इन्फ्लुएंस, वेयर एज द प्लेसेस away from the sea will have an extreme temperatures. राइट. अब आता है हमारा बच्चे एयर प्रेशर, के एयर प्रेशर को कौन से फैक्टर्स इन्फ्लुएंस करते हैं. नंबर 1 इज द एल्टीट्यूड, नंबर 2 इज द टेम्परेचर, and number 3 is the rotation of the earth. So let's just do that in detail. So number 1 factor is the altitude. So let me explain that to you. So see, altitude, how does it affect? Now it is highest at the sea level and it will decrease with the height. So the maximum air pressure will be near the sea level and it will decrease with the increasing height. Right? Number 2 is the temperature. देखो, when the temperature is high, ये समझ में आ गया आपको, the air is hot, it will expand. Now when the air expands, that means air का pressure जो है, that is lower now. And when the temperature is low, the air pressure is high. Now remember again, I'll just talk to you about this. See, the low pressure कैसे होता है. यहाँ पर जब you have higher temperature, मतलब ज़्यादा hot है, ज़्यादा गर्मी है, so of course air भी hot होगी. जब वो एयर हॉट हुई तो एयर जो है वो एक्सपैंड करती है, राइट। आपको पता है कि एयर जैसे वार्म होगी इट विल राइज अप। सो जब वो राइज अप करेगी तो यहाँ जो एरिया है दैट विल क्रिएट अ लो प्रेशर एरिया। जबकि व्हेन द टेम्परेचर इज लो मीन्स जब वहाँ ठंड है, सो एयर प्रेशर विल बी हायर। Then the movement of the air always takes place, this is very very important, from a high pressure area to the low pressure area. So the movement of the air will always take place from the higher pressure area to the lower pressure area. So very quickly now we have done that. Now I talked about the temperature. Let me have my temperature insulation. मैंने बता दिया आपको कि बच्चे इक्वेटर के पास टेम्परेचर हायर है, जैसे आप पोल्स के पास जाओगे टेम्परेचर आपका लो होता जाएगा। हाइट अबव द सी लेवल, डिस्टेंस फ्रॉम द सी लेवल, ऑफ कोर्स जो एरिया सी के पास है उनका टेम्परेचर जो है वो मॉडरेटिंग होगा, जो एरिया सी से दूर हैं उनके टेम्परेचर जो है वो एक्सट्रीम होंगे। फिर आ गया बच्चे आपका एयर प्रेशर। मैंने आपको सबसे पहले एल्टीट्यूड बता दिया है। सो एल्टीट्यूड के साथ जो है आपका ऑफ कोर्स जितना वो सी लेवल के पास है उतना ज़्यादा एयर प्रेशर है, एंड जैसे जैसे वो ऊपर जाएगा फ्रॉम द सी लेवल, नाउ दिस हियर द एयर प्रेशर इज मोस्ट, एंड एज वी गो अप द एयर प्रेशर विल डिक्रीज। मैंने आपको टेम्परेचर का भी बता दिया कि जहाँ पर भी टेम्परेचर हाई है, दैट मीन्स अगर मैं कहूँ कि कहीं जो है आपका टेम्परेचर बहुत ज़्यादा हाई है, सो व्हाट विल हैपन, द एयर विल एक्सपैंड, एंड व्हेन द एयर एक्सपैंड इट राइजेज अप। व्हेन द एयर इज वार्म्ड अप वो ऊपर राइज करेगी। राइज करने से क्या होगा, यहाँ पर जो है आपका लो प्रेशर एरिया विल बी बिल्ट अप, एंड अगर टेम्परेचर हाई है सो ऑब्वियसली द एयर प्रेशर इज ऑल्सो हाई, राइट। रोटेशन का मैंने आपको बोल दिया बच्चे, हमेशा याद रखना है कि द एयर ऑलवेज द मूवमेंट ऑफ द एयर इज ऑलवेज फ्रॉम द हाई प्रेशर टू द लोअर प्रेशर एरिया। All right, now comes your next topic, that is winds. Again, winds can be difficult to understand, but once you understand, it is going to be a very very easy concept. But before you understand winds, you have to understand one important thing, that is what causes the wind. आप लोगों ने अपने साइंस की क्लास में भी ये किया होगा कि winds जो है बेसिकली जैसे ही कोई भी wind जो है ड्यू टू द प्रेजेंस ऑफ सन जो है वो गर्म होती है, इट rises up, and cooler air it tries to take its place. So this air in motion is known as wind, and difference in the atmospheric pressure, हमने पढ़ा है कि जहाँ पर आपकी जो है एयर एक्सपैंड करेगी वो लो प्रेशर है, जहाँ पर जो है आपकी एयर एक्सपैंड नहीं हो रही है वहाँ टेम्परेचर आपका हायर है, दैट विल बी अ हाई प्रेशर एरिया। सो ये डिफरेंस इन द प्रेशर क्रिएट्स द एयर इन मोशन। नाउ विंड forms and carries clouds, influences air, oceanic transport and communication. आप अपने अगले चैप्टर में विंड का जब रोल प्ले पढ़ोगे तो आप पढ़ोगे विंड ही है जो वेव्स कॉज करती हैं। जितनी ज़्यादा जो विंड है ऑब्वियसली द वेव्स विल बी जेंटल if the wind is slow, it will be strong if the wind is too much, right? Now winds also contain a form of energy which is called as the kinetic energy in lieu of its motion, that is kinetic energy. देखो विंड को मेजर करने के लिए दो अलग अलग इंस्ट्रूमेंट्स हैं। अगर आपने विंड की डायरेक्शन मेजर करनी है देन यू हैव अ विंड वेन। अगर आपने विंड की स्पीड मेजर करनी है देन यू हैव द एनीमोमीटर, राइट। एंड देयर आर थ्री टाइप ऑफ विंड्स, यू हैव द परमानेंट विंड्स, यू हैव द सीजनल विंड्स, एंड यू ऑल्सो हैव द लोकल विंड्स। सो जस्ट अंडरस्टैंड हियर, यहाँ पर इंपॉर्टेंट आपको ये समझना है, air in motion is called as wind, as I'm just kind of trying to show you that this is air in motion, that is wind. और ये motion, what creates this motion? Difference in the atmospheric pressure, right? Now wind also contains a form of energy which is called a kinetic energy, which is formed because of its movement, right? Now, wind direction, I told you wind direction is measured by wind vane and speed is measured by your anemometer. And there are three type of winds: permanent wind, seasonal wind, and your local winds. All right, now this diagram is very, very important. If you understand this diagram, then I think you'll be able to understand all the three type of winds, the winds that we will be doing. Now, this area that I'm talking is the equator, and this is the low pressure area. Now again you have to understand इक्वेटर के पास लो प्रेशर एरिया क्यों है, क्योंकि यहाँ पर जो है आपकी गर्मी है, गर्मी के वजह से हवा जो है वो राइज करती है, वो एक्सपैंड करती है. सो यहाँ का हवा का प्रेशर जो है, एयर प्रेशर जो है वो कम है. एंड हमने इसी कॉन्सेप्ट को याद रखना है कि जैसे ये ऊपर जाती है पोल्स के तरफ जो है आपका एयर प्रेशर जो है इट विल इंक्रीज, राइट. सो लेट्स जस्ट start doing that. Now we come to the permanent winds. Now why are they called as the permanent winds? See, they are called as permanent because they blow in a particular direction throughout the year. Now first we will talk about the trade winds. Now these trade winds, they always flow from the subtropical high pressure belts. That is from here. If you can just see from here, so they basically blow from the subtropical high pressure belts towards the low pressure belt. Now this near the equator, now this area is the low pressure belt. So from here these winds will blow from the higher subtropical higher pressure belt towards the low pressure belt, and these winds are known as the trade winds. Right? So let me just explain more about that. All right, so now just think about it. Why were they known as the trade winds? Little trivia for you, but I will try to answer this question for you. Now, trade winds were so named because ships actually used to take advantage of them, and these winds used to help them to have their journeys between Europe and America. So that kind of helped them in actually sailing during this time. So that is how it got the name as the trade winds. Now the other permanent winds are the westerlies. Now what are westerlies? Now I have used two different colors. Now these are the trade winds. If you can just see from here. Now these are the trade winds. Now we are talking about the westerlies. Now they originate from the subtropical high pressure belt towards the subtropical low pressure belt, and they originate from the western direction. So these are the areas where I'm talking about this westerlies. They blow from the subtropical high pressure area towards the subtropical low pressure area. That means they are blowing towards here. Now these winds are known as the westerlies, and these are permanent winds because that is how they kind of blow throughout the year. So we've done the trade winds, we've done the westerlies, and now we'll do the polar winds. Now they blow from the polar high pressure belt to the subpolar low pressure belt. That is, if you could just see from here. So that means these winds that we talk, they are the trade winds. They blow from the high pressure to the low pressure. Then these winds, they are the westerlies, right? And these winds that we are talking about, that is, they blow from the polar high pressure. These are the poles. So polar high pressure towards the subpolar low pressure belt. Now this area is known as the polar wind. So you have the trade winds, you have the westerlies and the polar winds, and they blow in both the northern and the southern hemisphere. In fact, there is so much to be taught in these winds, but probably because you're in grade 7 right now, so I don't think I will not go beyond this. But there are a lot of, this called as the Coriolis effect, that why do these winds change their direction in the northern and southern hemisphere. So I will leave that for your grade 8 now. So just try to understand the first diagram, which I just showed it to you. That's very, very important. Even before that. Yes, this one. Now, this is a really important diagram. If you are able to understand the belt, the pressure belt areas, talking about the winds will be very, very easy. The trade winds which blow from the subtropical high pressure area towards the equatorial low pressure belt, right? And then we talk about the westerlies. They blow from the subtropical higher pressure belt towards the subtropical low pressure belt. Then we talk about the polar winds, and they blow from here, that is polar high pressure to belt towards the subpolar low pressure belt, and these are known as the polar winds. Now these are the also called as permanent winds because that is how they blow throughout the year. Now comes your seasonal winds. See, seasonal winds, the biggest example is the monsoons. Now monsoons are the seasonal winds which blow during the months of June to September, and they bring with them a lot of moisture, and it is this moisture that brings rain in the Indian subcontinent. Now these winds, they change their direction in different seasons during the year, and they blow only during the specific season like the monsoon winds, and they bring rain to the whole country. They change their direction with the change of seasons. Like, when these monsoon starts in June, and in September we call them as the retreating monsoons, right? So all this little more details for grade 8. Now comes the local winds. See, local winds are something which is in terms of very specific to that local area, right? Now they could blow during a particular period of the day or year, and the winds have their own special characteristics, and they only blow over a small area. So number one example is the land and sea breeze, and they have their local names in these coastal areas. So number two is, just hold on. Okay, one is Lu, that is hot and dry winds which blow in the northern India in summer season. Then the land and sea breeze, as I talked about. Then is cyclone and the anti-cyclone winds as well. Now we'll be talking about cyclone and anti-cyclone. Now, basically, what is a cyclone? See, if you just see the picture here, so this area, it actually moves like this. It is also, the word cyclone also makes a snake, means a snake coil, right? So it's an area of low pressure surrounded by the area of high pressure, and winds blow in a spiral manner at a great speed towards the low pressure center. It is accompanied by heavy rains, and it causes intense damage, and this mainly occurs in the tropical region, that is between the tropics, the Tropic of Cancer and Tropic of Capricorn. That particular area is called as the tropical region. So this is how a cyclone would be: an area of low pressure surrounded by the high pressure, and the wind will blow in a spiral manner at a great speed towards the low pressure center, right? Now comes your anticyclone. See, this is how an anticyclone looks like. Now, इसमें फ़र्क क्या है? इसमें there's a high pressure area surrounded by a low pressure. Now here you won't have that kind of, really big storms and heavy rainfall. The gentle winds blow out in all the directions from the center, and they bring fine weather and clear skies. So that is the difference between the two. Here the area of low pressure surrounded by the high pressure, whereas in an anticyclone it is an area of high pressure surrounded by the low pressure, right? And again, if you just see from here, that here the winds blow in a spiral kind of form. They move like this. It's not exactly the same, but something like a spiral manner, and it the great speed towards the low pressure, right? And it is accompanied by heavy rains, cause a lot of damage, and they only occur in the tropical regions. I think the super cyclone of Odisha, on the 29th October 1999 is called as the biggest cyclone of the century. And now we come to the anticyclone. As I told you, bache, here the high pressure area inside is surrounded by a low pressure area, right? And gentle winds blow out in all directions from the center, and they bring about fine weather and clear skies. All right. Now the next important area is linked to rainfall. And जब भी बच्चे हम rainfall की बात करेंगे, हम बात करेंगे humidity की. Why humidity? Because humidity means the water vapor present in the air. And again, it varies from place to place depending upon the temperature conditions. Humidity is high when the water vapor present in the air is more. Na? Normally, you must have heard in news when they say it's very humid today. Very humid means कि आपके air में जो moisture content है, जो water vapor है, वो बहुत ज़्यादा है. Again, bache, it will depend from place to place and also depending upon the weather or the temperature conditions, right? Okay, now this is also linked to temperature. Now, agar aapka temperature high, temperature always think it as heat or hotness. So hotness is high, that means बहुत ज़्यादा गर्मी है. So rate of evaporation भी बहुत ज़्यादा high है. So will be the humidity. If the temperature is low, the capacity of the air to hold moisture is very less. So that means even the humidity level will be low. So higher the temperature, higher will be the humidity, and lower the temperature, lower will be the humidity. And the instrument to measure the humidity is hygrometer. Now the next, when we talk about the rainfall, there are certain, important terms that your book has mentioned about, that is the dew point, the clouds, precipitation. Now let me teach you what these terms are. Now, first is a dew point. Now, at a given temperature, the capacity of the air to hold moisture is limited. That means at a given time, बच्चे एक जो air की capacity है to hold moisture is limited. It is not that it can keep on holding that moisture. So जब वो maximum water vapor hold कर देता है और इससे ज़्यादा वो नहीं hold कर सकता, it is said to be saturated, that it cannot hold more than this water vapor. And the temperature at which the air gets saturated is called as the dew point. So dew point is nothing but the temperature at which the air gets saturated. Saturated means that air cannot hold any more moisture. Now, with this saturation point comes the concept of the clouds. Now, as the temperature of the saturated air falls, the water vapor in it condenses, forming the droplets of water. Now, these droplets join together to form bigger drops, and the huge masses of water droplets are called as the clouds, right? So, let me explain that to you in a little more detail. So we can easily say what are clouds. So if I go by this definition, then I'll say cloud is a mass of water drops or the ice crystals which are suspended in the atmosphere. And when these water droplets, they condense in the sky, and the condensation lets you see the water vapor, and this is how the clouds are formed. And when these droplets become too heavy to float in the air, they come down as the precipitation. And precipitation could be like rain, snow, sleet, hail, anything, because now these droplets cannot hold more moisture in them, so that it leads to precipitation. Now, there are various types of precipitation. There is rain, sleet, there is snow, there is hail, right? Now, let's talk about the rainfall. What is rainfall and what is the importance of rainfall? Now, in the next chapter, when I will be talking about water, I will tell you that only 3% of the water is what is available for drinking, and 2% of that is in the form of glaciers or the ice caps, so that 1% which is available in the groundwater, and the main source of that is rainfall. Now, rainfall is very important for the vegetable cover and it is the main source of the groundwater. It is also the main source of the fresh water. And ये rainfall जब हम कई बार drizzle की बात करते हैं, drizzle is nothing but very tiny drops of water. They are called as drizzle. Now, rain is measured by an instrument called as the rain gauge. Now let's talk about the three different type of rainfalls. One is the convectional rainfall, the other is the relief or the orographic rainfall, and number three is the cyclonic rainfall. Now, first is the convectional rainfall. Let me just explain it to you, and I've made my slide in such a way so that it becomes very easy for you to understand. Now, when the column of hot air expand, hot air जैसे ही बच्चे expand करेगी, it will rise and it will reach the upper layers of the atmosphere. And when that hot air reaches the upper layers of the atmosphere, हमने layers में पढ़ा है कि वहाँ पर temperature जो है decrease हो जाता है, यानी कि वहाँ पर ये heatness जो है ये कम हो गई है. So what happens? There is condensation of the moisture which leads to formation of the clouds. अब क्लाउड्स में जब ये और मॉइस्चर नहीं रख सकते हैं, दे प्रोड्यूस सडन एंड हैवी रेनफॉल. नाउ दिस टाइप ऑफ रेनफॉल इज कॉल्ड एज द कन्वेक्शनल रेनफॉल एंड दिस मोस्टली अकर्स इन द इक्वेटोरियल एरियाज, राइट? सो लेट्स हैव अ लुक एट इट्स डायग्राम, right? So basically what happens is, as I told you, that when it is hot, the sun gets the ground heated, so the air evaporates. Now air here is very cool, so it will condense. Condensation will take place. ये जो जितना भी आपका wind का condensation होगा, moisture laden winds जो हैं आपकी, they will eventually form the clouds, and when they cannot hold more moisture, that will result in the precipitation, and that is what is the convectional rainfall. So if I could just have my pointer here, there is a sun, that is first point that we have done, sun. Then there is evaporation, the air cools here, there is condensation which takes place, and of course that leads to rainfall, right? And so there is evaporation, condensation and precipitation. These are the three processes which are involved in the convectional rainfall. Now then comes the relief or the orographic rainfall. Now before I go on to explain this diagram, I've also prepared a slide for you. Now what happens here now? This you have to understand with a windward side and a leeward side. Now moisture laden winds in the presence of the mountain or hill, it ascends along the slope and leads to cooling of the rising air. जहाँ पर cooling होगी, it will lead to condensation and eventually in the rainfall. Now such type of rainfall is called as the relief or the orographic rainfall. And the other side of the mountain, which is called as the leeward side, will not receive as heavier rainfall as the windward side. So if we go on to see this, now you'll understand. Now here, if I could just explain it to you, there's a warm, moist air that is forced to rise over the high areas. We know the air here is cool, so यहाँ air cool है, that leads to condensation. It forms cloud, and cloud जो है, when they cannot bear more moisture जो है, it will rain. Now जैसे ही बच्चे ये हवा जो है, it will descend towards the leeward side of the mountain. This is also called as the rain shadow, because यहाँ जो है, it is probably a more drier area, a warmer and a drier area. So this kind of rainfall is called as the relief or the orographic rainfall. Right, so we did this. And the next one and the last in this is the cyclonic rainfall. So let me just explain it to you. Now what happens in the cyclonic rainfall? When the warm air mass and the cool air mass, they meet. Now क्या होगा बच्चे? Warm air जो है वो lighter है, so it will rise over the cold air mass. cools and condenses. Now, this causes rainfall along the path and is known as the cyclonic rainfall, and this is more or less associated with the cyclones. So, this is a diagram to explain the same. Just hold on. Right, so this is how you can explain through that diagram that where the warm air mass and the cold air mass meet. The warm air being lighter rises over the cold air. Now this air mass, the colder air mass, cools, condenses and forms the clouds, and this causes rainfall along the path. Now this kind of rainfall is associated with the cyclones. So this is the third part of the rainfall, that is the cyclonic. So we have done the convectional, we have done the relief or the orographic, and number 2 is the cyclonic rainfall. Now, before I talk about the pollution, I will say that rainfall is very important for the existence of our living existence of the biodiversity, I would say, because these rainfall is not only a source of fresh water, but it is again the rainfall which determines the vegetation, right? So that means rainfall is important. And in all this thing, I would just, one thing that I would like to tell you is that deforestation is something which is impacting our environment. And as young these educationalists, as you are right now in your grade 7, you need to understand how important is the plants for our Mother Earth. So I think as a little kid, you have to tell your parents also that please do not cut trees, grow more trees, and that is how our environment can be saved. Now we will talk about the pollution in the air. Now what exactly is the pollution in the air? Pollution means anything with the way there is a change in the composition of the air. Now what could change the composition of the air? One, there could be growing industrial activity, excessive burning of the fossil fuels, there are more number of automobiles on the road, and there are fires, there is burning of solid waste. So if I say name the chief air pollutants, which are actually the byproducts of whatever we are doing here, that is carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, chlorofluorocarbons, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxide, and lead. Now, what do they actually do? See, number one, they can pose a lot of serious health problems, loss of diversity, then they could damage the historical monuments, and this pollution is also one of the gravest threat to the environment, and this must be tackled quickly. And when I say especially about the rising number of automobiles, I think carpool is one way that can reduce the automobiles on the road, right? And the kind of industrial activity, I mean that more of choices that we are demanding, more of the industrial activity is happening. So you have to remember that all these things are adding pollution in our air. So that is all I have for you in this chapter. I know it's a really big chapter. So what you can do is, in the next series, I will be asking you some questions on it, and we can have about a 10-minute revision on this chapter, right? So see you again with a new chapter, and this time it will be water, and very soon I will have my videos on both the chapters, air and water, which will be like 10-minute revision on these chapters. So see you again with a new chapter, with a new concept. Stay at home, stay safe, and keep smiling. Thank you.